Hello, and welcome to an Earth Day presentation of an interview with Jordan Howell, author of Garbage in the Garden State. I'm John Beekman, Chief Librarian at the Jersey City Free Public Library, the most densely populated of the United States. Situated between two major metropolitan regions, New Jersey's traditional nickname, the Garden State, evokes the diverse range of land types and uses not easily visible from its famous turnpikes and parkways. As with much of the complicated politics of New Jersey, that diversity has been both a challenge and an opportunity for waste management as the population increased and industrial use developed, reaching crisis proportions in the post World War II period. While often associated with New Jersey tropes such as pollution from heavy industry and organized crime, notably in the HBO series The Sopranos, New Jersey's full history has found it in the forefront of developments in effective waste management. Jordan Howell's book untangles that rich history through a mix of interviews and deep dives into state, county, and municipal records, skillfully woven into a very accessible book. Jordan P. Howell is Associate Professor of Sustainable Business at Rowan University. His work examines the human dimensions of environmental problems with the intention of understanding the history of an issue in order to devise practical and meaningful solutions. He lives in New Jersey with his wife and daughter. We recorded this interview in March of 2024. So, Jordan, welcome, and thanks for joining me to talk about your book, Garbage in the Garden State, and the topic more broadly. So to start out, I wonder if maybe you could just tell us a little bit about your background and what drew you to this topic.
Yeah, so I've been doing research on the waste and recycling industry for well, it feels like forever. It's probably been about, 14, 15 years. And initially the thing that captured my attention was specifically incinerators, waste to energy incinerators. And you may know that these are pretty widely used in other parts of the world, European Union countries, Japan, Korea. Not really so widely used here in the US, even though it's the exact same technology. And that question of why do some places really embrace this method for waste disposal and others just sort of hate it? That seemed like a really interesting question to me. And so some of the research was looking at like why different US states and cities elected to use an incinerator versus a kind of focus on landfills. And so comparing that decision for Maui County in Hawaii, which was considering an incinerator and never built one, with Detroit, Michigan, and which did build one fairly early on, and then Portland, Maine, which also developed a facility, but it sort of was in conjunction with a landfill and a recycling center. So trying to understand, like, how did those decisions make sense for the communities or, different stakeholders, regulators, so on and so forth. And then I guess bigger picture, why the attitude in the US towards waste incinerators is generally pretty negative compared to other countries which, ostensibly maybe have stronger environmental track records, not really having a problem with them from at least from an environmental perspective. So that's what motivated the interest in garbage initially.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think you see that. I know people who work in other areas of the energy sector and attitudes towards different technologies vary from place to place. It is an interesting topic, and even all among the states that you mentioned, very different political climates and historical trajectories. So, yeah,
Absolutely.
interesting stuff.
Yeah.
All right, so now to focus in on New Jersey, and we'll start off sort of with a cliched image of the topic of garbage in New Jersey. The late New Jersey historian Mark Mappin called one of his books, "There's more to New Jersey than the Sopranos," right? And I think that certainly applies to your book. But you do open with a reference to that show, famously about a New Jersey crime syndicate whose business dealings include waste management.
Right.
Um, your main focus is on the development of legislation on the state level. So the business practices of organized crime are an occasional side note, And I do notice that you're always very careful in your language. But before we get to sort of the main part of your narrative, what were your sort of preconceived ideas about organized crime and waste management? And how did that change, or not during the course of your research?
I guess specific to that question, I think my ideas prior to the research were sort of the stereotype that this is a, dirty industry, so to speak, in the criminal sense, and that, it's literally dirty no matter whether you're in the mafia or not. But just that those stereotypes, they're, well, that's what it is. And then especially in a place like New Jersey, where, quote unquote, everyone knows that there's a broader presence of organized crime. And the reality I think is far more interesting. Like, some of it is true. It really was that way, and some of it has changed over time, and some of what organized crime had established with regard to waste management, in some ways you can argue was simply replicated by the state of New Jersey as far as the regulatory regimes that they set up. So that's kind
Mhm.
of interesting, and I'm sure the anthropologists out there could look into, whether or not organized crime, you know, does it replicate the services of government in some instances in the presence of a vacuum of those services being provided by a legitimate
Mhm.
market entity? Uh, maybe, maybe it does, and that's sort of interesting, well down a different rabbit hole, but it's interesting to observe.
Yeah, well, I mean, sometimes crime and corruption is when the other guy's doing it, and
Right.
working the regulatory regime is when you're doing it, right?
Yeah. I guess
Uh,
the key distinction, in that instance, or at least in New Jersey, was, and maybe most instances of organized crime, is you have the threat of violence backing up something versus the kind of other mechanisms that the state has, which you'd hope would not include, violence and extortion and things like that.
right, yeah.
Yeah.
The different levers of power, sure, and
Right. Right. Yeah.
I certainly wouldn't want to minimize that by being flippant. So
Yeah.
that's an
Yeah.
excellent point. Uh, but now moving on, from that, so the bulk of your text really focuses on the history of statewide efforts to grapple with the challenges of just ever growing problems of waste management in this, most densely populated state in the nation, covering from the mid 60s to the late 1990s and then into today. So can you talk a little bit about the conditions of the 1960s that led to this move to attempting statewide policies on waste management?
Yeah, I think a few things, kind of came together. I think one is, rapid kind of economic growth in the state. New Jersey's long been a fairly wealthy place, and it's pretty easy to understand that as people become more wealthy, they consume more stuff, and they have more waste as a result. And then alongside that, really explosive suburbanization. So new communities for people to live, folks needing stuff to, put in their homes, having families in places where maybe they weren't before. So there's more people on top of it. And then, of course, New Jersey being wedged between two, very large cities, Philadelphia and New York, and historically having been the recipients of a lot of that waste, and all of that kind of happening at the same time. And I think, one of the reasons why the state, got involved in regulatory action in the 1960s, at least I would argue, is that, in the context of a broader environmental movement, um, you know, citizens, voters, however you want to call them, started to demand something different. And, you see in the book that prior to state regulatory action, solid waste management was sort of a question of like, what otherwise worthless piece of land can we dump all this stuff on? Um, without really any regard for whether it was like wetlands or just an abandoned quarry or maybe a purpose-built, kind of landfill type of thing. There were certainly no shortage of old school incinerators in New Jersey that don't generate electricity, but do kind of burn at a low temperature and generate lots of, soot and stuff that you really don't want to be around. And so I think all those things kind of came together at the same time, but I would argue, I think one of the precipitating events was the broader environmental movement. Um, you know, as your listeners may know, New Jersey has also been at the forefront of a lot of environmental issues, and particularly things related to cleanup and remediation. And you see that playing out over time with regard to the waste industry too, as places respond to some of those poorly managed landfills that I mentioned earlier.
Sure. And waste site remediation is certainly a big topic here in Jersey City and Hudson County, not only in landfills, but in uh, chromium dumping and things of that nature. So um, as your narrative moves through the 1970s, you're kind of looking at the challenges of establishing policies and practices on the different levels, whether it's municipal, county, and state levels. So I wonder if you could just expand a little bit about the developments that you trace across that time period. And especially, we're here in Hudson County, adjacent to the Meadowlands. So, if you could talk a little bit about that and how do conditions here compare to, other places in the state?
Yeah, I think that you know, the state taking action, like I said, was sort of in response to environmental concerns, sort of in response to kind of public health and well-being concerns. No one wants to live next to a dump, but particularly if it's one that is literally a dump without any sort of environmental management or whatever. And so you can make a good argument that you're depressing land values and things of that nature. Let's, thinking specifically about the Meadowlands, we have to remember that this was the dumping ground for New York City forever, for a long Staten Island and then the Meadowlands. I mean, it's even sort of referenced as such in books like The Great Gatsby. If you saw the film adaptation of that, the recent one, they sort of show this valley of ashes, and you can imagine that that's probably what parts of the Meadowlands were looking like when there were sort of uh, burns or other attempts at managing these flows of waste from New York City in particular. I think one of the aspects of state response that's important to remember is just trying to get some amount of control over where waste is going. This was an issue that historically did not have a lot of government involvement. It was not something government particularly cared about. And so trying to demonstrate, well, one, does government have any kind of standing to be involved in waste? Well, sure, on public health and environmental protection grounds, sure it does. At least that was the case the state made. And then on top of that, like, well, what are you going to do, to try to bring this under some sort of control? And I think the thinking at the time was, well, we've done kind of master planning exercises for lots of other things in New Jersey around housing or transportation and so on and so forth. Like, let's extend that thinking to waste management. And, maybe in a state this small, geographically, it makes sense for the state government to be the kind of lead planner as far as what's going to happen to all of this stuff. And so some of the initial attempts, as you read in the book, were the state trying to dictate what's going to go where, and kind of counties and local governments not really liking that, understandably, not not enjoying being told by a state bureaucrat like where the landfill is going to go. And so, as the story goes on, the kind of responsibility gets delegated or thrust upon, depending on who you ask. Because there's plenty of people still around who worked on these issues as they happened in real time. I got to interview them for the book. Counties were sort of, made responsible for this problem of waste management under directives from the state. That you have, if you generate it in the county, you more or less have to dispose of it in the county. That was initially the thinking. And there's an admirable, I think, kind of environmental ethos in there that you're going to be responsible for the waste that you generate. Um, and then a lot of the 70s and 80s trying to figure out like, this twin problem of how do we clean up all the old landfills, shut them down in a responsible way based on what we know about environmental science. And then where are we going to put new facilities, whether they're landfills or incinerators, in a way that, doesn't cause everyone to hate us and also is effective in actually, being a waste disposal site. So one thing I'll mention before we move on is, at one point there were like over 650 landfills in New Jersey. That's wild. That means some towns had more than one landfill. Now there's like 11.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So in that process, which that, great condensation, if you want to call it that, which is a phrase I just made up here, that
You
unfolded in
heard it
like
here
20,
first, folks.
yeah, that unfolded in like 20 years. So you
Wow.
still have an increasing amount of garbage that has to be dealt with. But now you have this regulatory push to send it to fewer and fewer places, which are sort of, more environmentally responsible places. So I believe it's still the case that the tallest man-made, human-made, structure in New Jersey is the Middlesex County landfill. From the
Oh.
base of it to, to the top of it. So
Oh.
that's sort of an interesting attribute.
I don't know that I had heard that before, and
Yeah.
we can all fact check that
Yeah, you can
afterwards.
fact check that, but it was told to me in a very matter-of-fact way by someone from the state of New Jersey, and I assume that they, didn't make it up.
Oh,
So
oh,
yeah.
wow, wow. No, I don't know what to say about that.
I know. What do you go from there?
So, um, another sort of set of tensions that you trace in the book is about, across the 80s and 90s, and you talked a little bit before about your interest in waste energy incinerators. But so you sort of trace the tensions between the alternatives to waste management, landfills, like we were just talking about, incineration, and then, increasingly recycling. Uh, this video is going to debut on Earth Day 2024, and this year's theme is Planet versus Plastics. So maybe just this is a good time to talk a little bit about the history of plastic recycling. Is it real?
Oh,
And because it's very different from paper, glass, or metal recycling, right? Where it's a fairly simple process of breaking down and building up again, to the extent that I understand it. But maybe you presumably know a little bit more about the differences, and maybe can talk a little bit about that and how they played out in the New Jersey narrative.
yeah. So one thing before talking specifically about recycling, in this planning history, I guess, of the state with regard to waste, they went from, they being the state planners, county planners went from let's have a landfill in every county to let's have some landfills and every county is going to have its own incinerator, to like we'll have some landfills and some incinerators, but everyone is going to work really hard to recycle. That's been sort of the trajectory. And then if we update it to the present day, we would say, okay, those first three things are true. Plus, we're going to kind of look the other way when people send waste out of state to Pennsylvania, New York, Ohio, Virginia, all these other places. So, the incineration thing, the plan that every county plus the Meadowlands would have its own incinerator facility kind of goes back to this idea that, well, if you generate waste in the county, you need to dispose of it there. The concept is not terrible. There was a very reasonable argument about overcapacity. This is too many incinerators. We don't actually need this many. And then also that they're proving to be, looking at other states, extraordinarily expensive to build. Not quite as bad as nuclear power in the sense of, there's extensive delays and cost overruns. But most of the history of incinerators in the US, I don't think there's any that have come in under budget and ahead of schedule. And remember, it's county governments that are kind of footing the bill. And these are sort of maybe the least important level of government in New Jersey compared to state and municipalities. And so, trying to figure out, well, like, why do we have to come up with the money? Why do we have to cite this stuff? Like, a lot of reasonable questions. Recycling kind of emerged um, in the very late 1970s and early 1980s, again, out of the environmental movement. And this idea that we all know very well that we have all these materials, paper, plastic, metal, so on and so forth, that can be reused instead of having to use brand new materials. Currently, those are thrown away and they go to a landfill or they go into an incinerator. What if in New Jersey we said, all right, part of our waste management strategy is this intensive focus on recycling? Okay, that's great. We can kind of pitch that in environmental terms when we're selling it to people. We can also pitch it maybe behind the scenes, at least if you look at the kind of things that state government published about recycling, they tended to emphasize the environmental dimension. In
Sure.
interviewing people and kind of reading between the lines, it's pretty clear that recycling, it may have had this lofty intention, but the real value of it is keeping material out of a landfill and out of an incinerator so that you can extend the life of those things and that you don't have to cite a new one, which is damn near impossible in New Jersey to cite anything, but
Mhm.
especially something with some controversy around it, like a landfill or an incinerator. So if we understand that the purpose of recycling has always been to extend the life of disposal facilities, more so than achieve this environmental outcome,
Mhm.
recycling makes perfect sense in New Jersey.
Huh.
If you focus on it as an environmental, initiative, it really doesn't meet uh, the performance expectations, and in particular for plastic, it doesn't. It never did, though. You can look back
Yeah.
at congressional or state assembly and state senate hearings where they would interview people from the packaging industry and the plastics industry who would, basically the questioning would go like this: Is it true that plastic is recyclable? Yeah. What can you do with recycled plastic? Well, we're not sure, but probably something.
Mhm.
Okay, will people want to pay you for this in the same way that they'll pay for office paper and newsprint and cardboard and aluminum? Well, probably they'll pay us something, but we have no idea how much, if it will be profitable, or how much of a subsidy we would need.
Mhm.
Uh, so this is not new
Yeah.
information. This is 30-year-old, 40-year-old almost information in some instances that the market for plastics, it's just not there. Okay.
Yeah.
And so that's the reality, but then also the reality of, well, how do we keep this stuff out of a landfill or incinerator where it's sort of bulky, it takes up a lot of space? You know, putting a bunch of organic material in a landfill is not the worst thing that's ever happened because it
Right.
does break down over time. You can capture the methane, whatever. Putting a bunch of plastic in a landfill just takes up space forever.
Mhm.
And so what do we do with it? And it's not really clear. I
Yeah.
wrote this book as my environmental historian hat on. Most of my professional life, I teach in a business school. I teach
Right.
sustainability classes to business and MBA students.
Right.
And so more recent research, or sort of some of it unfolding in parallel with this book, has looked at ways of reforming the market for recycled material. um, what can we do to actually, develop viable end markets for these things where recycling would sort of live up to the environmental promise as well as, this important role that it has of extending the life of other facilities and sort of, you know, making people feel like they're involved in environmental protection and
Right.
all this other
Mhm.
sort of stuff. So, the state of New Jersey, to their credit, has been very interested in that research. They've supported the DEP that has supported some of our studies, um, which is terrific. The state, one thing I hope comes out or comes through in the book, is that all around, everyone in the waste industry, that at least that I interacted with or read about, everyone does have genuine intentions.
Mhm.
And especially folks who were around for the kind of crisis years in the 70s and 80s. Um, we have to find something that at least does the job, even if it does it imperfectly. And even today, like, there's good intentions. How do we actually manage this waste in a way that doesn't cause further environmental problems? And sometimes that does mean like, all right, we just have to send it somewhere. we don't want to send it to Pennsylvania, but it's a lot cheaper. And we certainly don't want it just sitting around and, in a warehouse in northern New Jersey, which does happen and has happened historically.
Right.
So, there's sort of a pragmatism that at one point had also some idealistic thought behind it about the environment. And I think is more kind of, at this point, like, let's make sure the system doesn't break and do
Hmm.
that in a way that where we're trying to be better, but really the goal is let's make sure it doesn't break. Yeah.
And I think for a long time, or at least a significant part of time, China was kind of taking it off our hands and letting us, not think about it, and they that option closed down. So it's kind of pressing
Yeah.
the need to really face up to this, to find out, what we
Yeah.
can do with this stuff if we are going to separate it and save it.
Recycling is really interesting. Some stuff is more or less infinitely recyclable. Aluminum, steel, things like that. Metals do really well. They're pretty easy to collect. For a long time, office paper and newsprint was really easy to collect and process. It had market value, and there were a lot of paper processors in northern New Jersey in particular. There was one that supplied most of the recycled newsprint for the East Coast newspapers. Of course, as people read less printed material and things become electronic, that sort of has these knock-on effects
Huh,
for recycling as
right.
well.
Huh.
Yeah.
More unintended consequences.
Yeah,
Policy has a lot to do with trying to figure out, adapt to unintended consequences, I think.
absolutely.
Um, and I know we want to respect your time here, but you know, just the sort of crux of your narrative changes. You note a change in the nature of New Jersey's waste management policies following there was a Third Circuit Court decision, Atlantic Coast demolition versus the chosen freeholders. And if you could just give us just kind of a brief summary of that case and how it marked a turning point in the history of garbage in the Garden State.
Yeah, one of the other things, kind of motivating factors for this book for me was like, learning a little bit about the history of waste management in New Jersey. And in particular, I want to mention my friend and colleague, a guy named Gary Sondermeyer, who was the chief of staff at the NJDEP for a long time. He was in the room writing a lot of the policies that are discussed in the book, and he since works in private industry. But he sort of, clued me into some of these things when I was just getting started with this project, and very generous with his time, very wonderful guy. But um, in any event, I said earlier on that in some ways the state's approach to regulation kind of mirrored what organized crime was doing, in the sense that organized crime would maybe decide amongst themselves, as you see in The Sopranos, like, okay, we're going to take this building, you take this other building, this is our neighborhood, this is your neighborhood, essentially carving up these franchise areas. The state didn't like that it was backed up by violence, but the kind of model that they came up with was essentially the same thing, where you'd have waste collection be a regulated utility, where there's sort of one kind of, sanctioned monopoly operating in a geographic area. That's not unusual for waste management. What New Jersey did that went a step further was saying, okay, within a certain geographic unit, whether it's the Meadowlands or eventually became a county, the county is going to decide where that garbage goes. So not just who collects it, but where they can take it to, and basically the price that they're going to pay when they get there. So this was a way of having a kind of built-in monopoly on waste disposal, where the prices you charged would essentially support the operation of the facility. It's not the worst idea you've ever heard for supporting public infrastructure, but it
Right.
did it did artificially increase prices a lot over surrounding states. And so eventually, companies in the waste hauling industry kind of got sick of paying inflated prices within New Jersey, and they sued the state. It did go to the Supreme Court. The Atlantic Coast case you mentioned was the first one. There was a subsequent um, case as well, where basically the U.S. Supreme Court said that it is not feasible for you to have this system of flow control, as it was known. That's unconstitutional. In the Constitution does not mention garbage, the U.S. Constitution, but sort of interpreted that garbage, even though it does not have a dollar value itself. Otherwise, you wouldn't have thrown it away.
Mhm.
The act of hauling and disposing of garbage does have an economic value. And if you involve, some sort of crossing of state lines, you get into this idea of the
Ah,
Commerce Clause.
mhm.
And it's actually very interesting. As a non-lawyer, I appreciated the legal education in researching this portion of the book. And so, the kind of franchise structure that the state had built to financially support its waste management regulations was struck down by the Supreme Court, and that sort of precipitated a whole new set of crises for the state. Um, it sort of has come back in a different way, like communities can they can opt in to have their county negotiate where their waste goes on their behalf.
Mhm.
So where I live in Camden County, there's I think 27 towns in Camden County. I think 25 of them, have delegated their power to choose where their waste goes to the county. They're not freeholders anymore. I forget the title they have now, but um, yeah, the county government and they sort of negotiate on their behalf. So in some ways, depending on where you are, they found kind of a workaround for flow control that is found to be, constitutional.
Right.
Um, but for whatever the state had built up, the sort of key foundation of it was pulled away with that Supreme Court case, and it did have repercussions for the rest of the country as well. Um, and not the only time that New Jersey has been in front of the Supreme Court for a garbage related issue. Something that I want to highlight in the book is that, for better or worse, New Jersey's been really been an innovator in waste management policy over the past, 60 years. And that's pretty interesting, to think that some of the decisions made, you know, in Arizona, just to pick a place, have something to do with a court case that happened in New Jersey about, whether or not Philadelphia has a legal right to dispose of their garbage here if they want, stuff like that.
Mhm.
Yeah, but the flow control thing, I think I think it kind of led the system that we have now, the infrastructure we have now, it hasn't really changed since that decision because it's a struggle to figure out like how would you finance new infrastructure? How would you kind of direct traffic to it? So maybe we'll just say, like I mentioned before, let's just try to manage the system we have so that it doesn't break
Hmm.
because we're not really sure where to go with it after this point.
Well, okay, and that's well, your book is very useful in setting that history, and those who are working now and will come after us to find their way through that, I think will definitely benefit from this summary. But before I let you go, I kind of like to nerd out a little bit on your research processes. I'm a special collections librarian, so I've kind of long been aware of these various state publications and reports and hearings that are publicly printed, but not widely distributed, and they'll be in some libraries throughout the state. So it's what we in the profession call gray literature, right? So your book really does make great use of that type of resource. I was really struck by that. So I wonder if you just talk a little bit about how you find and use those kind of resources.
Yeah, sure. The thinking behind it was like, all right, some of the folks that, we're going to be talking about, policymakers or industry people, they are dead. They don't want to talk anymore about this stuff. They're not, they don't respond to my requests like, hey, can I interview for my book? So like what's as close as I can get to, what actually happened? Well, were they ever recorded in like a testimony or, something like that? And a lot of times, in the kind of formative decades of waste management in New Jersey, yeah, there were a lot of like public hearings put on by the assembly or the state senate, sometimes local governments, and those were recorded, transcribed, sometimes covered by media, journalism, and you get an opportunity to see like, well, these are literally the words that people said. That's, I think, a different way of approaching a historical project like this than than just relying on like the text of, official statements and the legislation itself and things like that. So that was my thinking is like I'd like to interview people for the book when I can, and then like let's see what did they say on the record. And so finding that stuff, it was using the state of New Jersey's catalog, which is excellent. It takes a little bit maybe to figure out how it works.
Yeah.
But once you get a hang of it, there's so much available about really like every aspect of life in New Jersey. That was very interesting. As far as getting the stuff, I have to acknowledge and appreciate the librarians at Rowan University, who were able to kind of get some of the special collections types of things from the state's holdings, or else from Rutgers University, which has a very extensive holding of, I think they call it New Jerseyana,
Mhm.
and other state documents. And they were all able to share them through interlibrary loan. Um, and then, what's interesting, I think, as you mentioned, there's so much of this gray literature. It doesn't all get cataloged and kind of identified maybe as meticulously as other stuff, just because there's so much volume of it, especially, in the past when everything was printed and then you had to deal with it. And so like, finding reference in one piece of gray literature to something else,
Mhm.
that isn't actually in a catalog, but hey, look, I know it exists. Like it says it here. Like, can you help me find it? And librarians were wonderful in helping me find it. Oh, we didn't even know this was on the shelf. Like, oh, cool. Uh, so that sort of stuff. It was enjoyable in that way.
Oh, speaking as a reference librarian who sometimes is that person on the other end of that, it is a very
Right.
satisfying part of uh, of our practice too. As much as we wish everything was perfectly cataloged and given
Yeah.
infinite subject headings and cross references, there's still a lot of work to be done just
But
going through the
there's
shelf.
something to be said about like historical and archival research just in general. Like it's sort of like a time machine in a really interesting way. Like, with some of these topics, and especially for me, just because I am in the world of garbage, like you see some names that recur or some concepts that come up over and over, like trying to figure out like why some ideas like didn't actually work. Like New Jersey doesn't have a bottle bill, a bottle refund deposit
Mhm.
system. It's not because people don't care. There was, considerable debate on this subject of like, well, New York has one, Maine has one, California, lots of other states.
Mhm.
Why don't we have one? And like seeing the kind of like examination of that issue happen in real time, and like, well, who did they invite to give testimony on this? Like, all right, they had someone from the recycling industry, they had someone from an environmental group, then they had like 12 people from the food resellers association, so like grocery stores and convenience stores, who would be the main ones having to actually deal with this problem on their
Yeah.
location.
Mhm.
So like, all right, well, I wouldn't have thought of the food industry as being a stakeholder in this, but here they are, and it kind of makes sense, in the context of what policymakers are thinking about. Similar things for other industries that I think emerge only in the gray literature. Like, there was great consternation over the plastic industry's impact on glass blowers in New Jersey, which
Yeah.
a lot of them were in southern New Jersey, which is
Yeah.
comparatively poor, comparatively rural. You know, you can tell some politicians were grandstanding for their district, like, how dare you take our jobs? And others were saying, like, hey, your glass blower that you're defending is the same one investing in a plastic plant in another state. So like, so seeing that kind of like stuff, I think only you find in gray literature, because it's not necessarily portraying in the best light all the people who are participating. So it doesn't make it into like the news story or like the formal press release or stuff like that.
Yeah, it's a great opportunity for a deep dive, and I
Yeah.
really appreciate the that you took advantage of those resources, just both as a reader and as somebody who's charged with caring for them.
Yeah.
We're always happy we're holding them just so that somebody, someday will look at them.
Yeah.
Um,
It's
uh,
value. I mean, it's a public ser the other thing that kind of emerged to me is like, in an era when it seems like, we know more about what government is doing than ever before, but also like somehow less than what government is doing than ever before. Like it is absolutely valuable and essential that public libraries maintain these documents. I just as a taxpayer, I deserve to know what politicians were thinking when they made this policy that shapes my life. And there's no other place to find that kind of information except at a research library or a place that is a repository for this sort of gray literature. So, I think it's essential that exists in a democracy. That's a very different direction than a book on garbage, but it is a thought that kind of recurred in my mind when I'm working on this. Like, wow, I'm really glad that that we do have a requirement to maintain these things and make sure that they're there. That's valuable.
well, and we could go on and how that's changing in the
Yeah.
post-digital era, but
Yeah.
that would be the subject for a whole a different hour of conversation, which I would love to have. But I know you're a busy man, and I really appreciate the you taking the time to talk about your book. I'm going to hold it up here, but I'm also probably going to show it on the screen. Yeah, it's going to be invisible if I hold it
Okay.
up. Um, the book is Garbage in the Garden State. It's published by Rutgers University Press. Uh, Highly recommended. Just an unlikely subject to say it's a very entertaining and engaging book, but it really is. And yeah, thanks for taking the time. It was really nice talking to you.
Thank you, John. I always love talking about garbage. So thanks.
All right.